Imagine scientists digging up a 700-year-old grave and finding DNA so well preserved it rewrites everything we thought we knew about the Black Death. Because according to this new evidence, what killed half of Europe wasn't exactly what history books told us. The silent killer beneath the soil. Picture a cold morning somewhere in rural England. Mist hangs low over an empty field, and a team of archaeologists slowly brush away soil from what they believe is just another medieval burial site. But as the earth falls away, they uncover not one skeleton, but dozens. Bodies laid shoulder to shoulder, rushed into the ground without coffins, without rituals, without names, a panic burial. At first, scenes like this aren't unusual. Europe is full of forgotten mass graves from the 14th century, but this one is different. When researchers collect tiny samples from the teeth, tiny capsules of preserved blood, the DNA locked inside these medieval victims begins telling a story no one expected. For centuries, the Black Death has been described in simple terms: one disease, one bacterium, one unstoppable pandemic. But the new genetic evidence doesn't line up with that neat little explanation. Instead, what scientists find inside these ancient remains shakes the entire foundation of what we thought we knew. Because hidden in that soil is a killer far more complex than our history books ever admitted. As the samples are carried back into high-tech labs, scientists begin the long process of sequencing the DNA. They extract it in sterile rooms, piece by piece, building a genetic puzzle from fragments barely larger than dust. This is work that would have been impossible even 10 years ago. But today, technology can resurrect microscopic secrets from people dead for 7 centuries. When the genetic code finally appears on the lab screens, the first shock hits. The pathogen isn't exactly the Yersinia pestis strain we see today. It's older, wilder, and far more lethal. It carries genetic signatures unlike any modern version of the plague bacteria. It's almost as if the 14th century strain was a different creature entirely, one adapted for explosive, unstoppable spread. But that's only the beginning. As more graves are analyzed from France, Germany, Italy, Denmark, and even the edges of Russia, a disturbing pattern emerges. The DNA isn't uniform. It's not a single plague sweeping continent to continent. Instead, each region seems to show a slightly different version, a mutation here, a missing gene there. Sometimes multiple strains appear in the same city, raging at the same time. This isn't one pandemic. It's dozens of outbreaks, each driven by a pathogen mutating at terrifying speed. Scientists begin to ask questions that earlier historians never could. Why did the Black Death hit some places harder than others? Why did it kill half the population in one city, but barely a third in another? Why did it move so quickly, sometimes crossing entire kingdoms in a matter of weeks? The DNA holds the answer. And the answer is chilling. It wasn't one killer. It was a swarm. A constellation of rapidly evolving plague strains, each optimized in its own horrible way for spreading, infecting, and killing. Some strains were better at infecting lungs. Others had a gift for riding fleas and rats. Some mutated to survive inside humans longer. Others burned hot and fast, leaving behind devastation. The medieval people dying in those mass graves weren't facing a single enemy, they were trapped in an evolutionary storm. Imagine living in that world. You hear rumors of a sickness miles away. You pray it doesn't reach your village, but when it finally arrives, it looks different from what you heard. It kills differently. It spreads differently. And no matter what people try, burning herbs, quarantining houses, fleeing cities, nothing works, because every outbreak is a new version of the same monster. And then comes the detail that truly terrifies modern scientists. The genetic timeline shows the plague was mutating during the pandemic, not before or after. It was adapting in real time, right inside the bodies of medieval victims, which means the more it spread, the deadlier it became. By now, the researchers realize they're looking at something unprecedented. The greatest pandemic in human history wasn't just a bacterial invasion, it was a rolling biological catastrophe, shifting shape faster than anyone could ever hope to understand. But the question remains, what was causing the pathogen to mutate so violently? To uncover that, we have to leave the mass graves behind and travel deep into the heart of medieval Eurasia, where the true trigger of the Black Death was quietly building for decades. The mutating monster, a plague that changed its face. If Chapter 1 showed us the graves, Chapter 2 reveals the creature hiding inside them, because what scientists discovered next stunned even the experts who had spent their entire careers studying Yersinia pestis. The plague bacterium is supposed to be predictable, stable, slow to change. Modern strains barely mutate at all, which is why studying them has always been straightforward. But when researchers sequenced the DNA from medieval skeletons, they didn't find stability, they found chaos. It was like opening a history book expecting one version of events, and instead discovering 50 conflicting eyewitness accounts. In the 14th century, the plague wasn't just a disease. It was an evolving predator. Picture a timeline where most bacteria take small, occasional steps, tiny adjustments to survive new environments. But the medieval plague, it was sprinting, mutating dozens of times faster than normal, every few years, even every few months. It seemed to rewrite itself. To understand this strange behavior, imagine a wolf suddenly growing the speed of a cheetah, the strength of a bear, and the camouflage of a tiger, one trait added every time it hunts. That's what the plague was doing. It was adapting, absorbing advantages as it spread from village to village, body to body. One particular mutation shocked researchers. In victims from the early 1340s, the DNA showed a version of the bacterium that seemed optimized for flea transmission, thriving inside a flea's gut and clogging it so badly that the starving insect bit, aggressively injecting bacteria with every bite. This was the classic bubonic strain. But in graves dated just a decade later, another mutation appeared, a strain far better at surviving in human lungs. This one wasn't waiting for fleas. It didn't need rats. It jumped person to person through the air in crowded homes, markets, and churches. This was the dreaded pneumonic form. And the most terrifying part, both forms evolved at the same time. It was like fighting an enemy that could attack from the shadows one day and storm your walls the next. Scientists noticed something else, too. In some grave sites, DNA from both strains appeared in the same location, sometimes in victims buried only days apart. Imagine the horror of watching one wave of sickness sweep your town: fever, swelling buboes, painful lymph nodes, and then suddenly, with no warning, a newer, faster strain arrives, attacking lungs directly and killing within 48 hours. Medieval doctors didn't stand a chance. They weren't dealing with one disease, they were facing a predator that kept changing its clothes. But what caused these extreme mutations? At first, researchers thought maybe the bacteria simply evolved naturally while spreading across the continent. More hosts, more opportunities for genetic error, simple math. But the data didn't fit. The mutation rate wasn't slow and steady. Came in burst spikes of rapid change followed by short periods of stability. This punctuated evolution hinted at something bigger happening, something external. For a bacterium to mutate this explosively, it usually needs extreme pressure from its environment. It needs stress, survival challenges, constantly shifting battlefield. And medieval Europe, as it turns out, was the perfect battlefield. When researchers compared the mutation spikes to environmental records, tree rings, ice core samples, climate reconstructions, the patterns clicked into place. Every time the 14th century climate swung. Suddenly harsh cold one year, scorching drought the next, the plague bacterium seemed to snap into a new form. But climate alone couldn't explain the full picture. The real breakthrough came when scientists examined plague DNA from skeletons in Central Asia, far from Europe. These strains were older and even more chaotic. The same cycles appeared there too: bursts of mutation, sudden expansions, sudden collapses. And that led to a new hypothesis. The Black Death didn't begin as one stable line that marched into Europe. It began as an entire cluster of strains spreading across Asia, mutating wildly in response to changing temperatures, shifting rodent populations, and unstable ecosystems. By the time the disease reached European shores, it wasn't a single monster, it was a family of monsters, each deadlier than the last. Imagine being a medieval villager hearing rumors of a sickness in far-off lands. By the time it reached your doorstep, it was no longer the sickness your neighbor described. It had changed. It had grown sharper teeth. Scientists studying these medieval genomes realized something chilling. This wasn't just evolution, it was acceleration. The plague was being pushed, pressured, sculpted into its deadliest form. But what was applying that pressure with such intensity? Why was the environment of the 1300s so unstable that it turned a common bacterium into a world-ending killer? To answer that, we need to travel back even further before Europe, before the Mediterranean, before the trade ships. We need to return to the birthplace of the plague itself, where climate chaos and ecological collapse were quietly setting the stage for the greatest catastrophe in human history. The real trigger, climate chaos and the great rodent collapse. To understand what transformed the plague into a shape-shifting killer, we have to journey thousands of miles east beyond Europe's castles and villages, deep into the wine-scoured grasslands of Central Asia, because long before the Black Death crossed borders and oceans, its story began here, in a world ruled not by kings or armies, but by rodents. For centuries, the Mongolian steppe was home to vast populations of wild rodents, marmots, gerbils, ground squirrels, and other small mammals that acted as natural reservoirs for plague bacteria. Most of the time, the disease stayed balanced in this ecosystem. The rodents lived with it, the fleas fed on them. The bacteria circulated quietly. Nothing catastrophic happened. But in the 1300s, nature broke its own rules. True records and ancient ice cores show that the 14th century wasn't a normal time for Eurasia. It was an era of violent climate swings, years of heavy rain followed immediately by brutal droughts, sudden freezes, and unexpected temperature spikes. The weather flip-flopped unpredictably, almost yearly, creating an ecological nightmare. And the rodents suffered first. Imagine a spring so wet the ground turns to mud, perfect for grass growth. Rodent populations explode, tens of thousands breeding across the plains. Then, suddenly, a winter arrives so cold it kills nearly all of them. Fleas, desperate and starving, abandon their dying hosts and jump to whatever warm body they can find. That warm body may be another animal, or it may be a human. Genetic and environmental data show that these rodent boom and bust cycles lined up almost perfectly with the mutation spikes in the plague DNA. Every time the weather triggered a population explosion, the bacteria spread aggressively. Every time famine struck the rodents, fleas were forced to find new hosts, and each new host was a chance for the bacterium to mutate, adapting, strengthening, evolving. In other words, the plague didn't mutate randomly. Nature was squeezing it like a blacksmith hammering iron. When rodent populations crashed, the bacteria were pushed into survival mode, under extreme pressure. They mutated faster. Some strains got better at living inside fleas, others at infecting mammals, and still others at surviving new climates. The ecosystem itself was forging deadlier versions of the disease. But rodents weren't the only victims. Humans were moving into these regions too. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire expanded across Asia, establishing trade routes that connected remote villages, bustling cities, and merchant caravans. Goods moved faster, people traveled further, and fleas traveled with them. A dying rodent on one side of the steppe might send a hungry flea into a merchant's saddlebag, then to a camel caravan, then to a trading port, and eventually onto a ship bound for the Middle East or Europe. Climate chaos didn't just affect animals. It helped create the perfect transportation network for mutated plague strains to begin their journey west. Researchers studying medieval plague DNA found something astonishing. The earliest strains in Europe didn't match a single source. Instead, several genetically distinct strains appeared almost simultaneously in different regions. That means Europe wasn't one by one invading pathogen. It was hit by multiple waves, each likely originating from different climate-stressed pockets of Central Asia. Imagine the 14th century plague as a storm with several thunderheads forming at once. Each cloud is a mutated strain, each one is deadly, and all of them are drifting toward unsuspecting populations, but to medieval people, this chain of events was invisible. They didn't see dying rodents on distant plains. They didn't understand how a shift in rainfall thousands of miles away could cause a plague outbreak in their village. They only saw the consequences: families collapsing in the streets, neighbors fleeing, priests unable to bury the dead fast enough. To them, the plague was a curse from heaven. In reality, it was a chain reaction triggered by climate instability. The Great Rodent Collapse of Central Asia didn't just release the plague, it destabilized an entire ecological system. Fleas abandoned their natural hosts, bacteria jumped to new species, mutations exploded, and these mutated strains began spreading along the most interconnected network the world had ever known: Silk Road. By the time the disease reached Europe's borders, it wasn't a single predictable enemy, it was a legion, each strain shaped by droughts, storms, and collapsing ecosystems thousands of miles away. But climate alone wasn't enough to unleash the devastation that followed, because once the plague reached Europe, it encountered something even more deadly than weather, something humans built with their own hands. So what happened when these mutated strains entered medieval cities, overcrowded, filthy, and ripe for infection? That dark transformation begins in Chapter 4. The cities that became death traps when the plague finally crossed into Europe. It didn't arrive as a lone wanderer, it marched in like an invading army, carried by merchants, sailors, fleas, and rats. But what it found waiting for it was something even more dangerous than its own: mutations, a continent full of cramped, filthy, overcrowded cities perfectly engineered to help it spread. To understand the explosion that followed, imagine stepping into a medieval city in the 1340s. The streets are narrow, so narrow that two passing carts can barely avoid colliding. There's no pavement, only mud mixed with animal droppings and human waste. Open drains run along the edges of every road, overflowing whenever it rains. Rats scurrying and out of taverns, granaries, and stables, treated as little more than background noise. And above this maze of filth, a population packed shoulder to shoulder. A single wooden house might shelter 3 families: grandparents, parents, children, even animals. In the winter months, people sleep close enough to feel each other's breaths. Windows, if they exist at all, are tiny holes stuffed with rags to keep out drafts. Ventilation is almost non-existent. Now imagine introducing a highly mutated, fast-spreading bacterium into this environment. It was like lighting a match in a barrel of gunpowder. The earliest European outbreaks exploded in port cities: Messina, Genoa, Venice, Marseille. Ships would dock after long journeys across the Mediterranean, unloading cargo, and fleas, rats dying in the ship's hold, would crawl out onto the docks in their final moments, spreading starving fleas searching for new hosts. One ship could infect an entire coastline. But the plague didn't stop at the ports. It moved inward along trade roads, carried by merchants who had no idea they were transporting death. It hid in sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, and even in the fur of cats and dogs. Cities connected by commerce became stepping stones. And at each stop, the disease found ideal conditions to thrive. Because medieval cities weren't just crowded, they were biological amplifiers. Inside homes, warmth from cooking fires made fleas more active. Human bodies sleeping close together gave the plague easy access to new victims. And unlike in the open plains of Central Asia, rats in cities thrived. They lived in walls, under floors, jumping from roof to roof on connected wooden beams. It was a rat paradise and a human nightmare. But the most devastating factor wasn't the rats at all. It was us. People didn't understand contagion. They didn't know bacteria existed. So when someone fell sick, families would gather around their beds, praying, comforting, touching exactly the behavior the plague needed. Doctors visited homes without protective gear. Priests performed last rites for dozens every day. Gravediggers collected bodies but never disinfected themselves. Every act of compassion unknowingly fed the disease. And as the plague mutated into its pneumonic form, cities turned from dangerous to apocalyptic. Pneumonic plague didn't need rats or fleas. It traveled through droplets, coughs, breath, even shared air in smoke-filled rooms, in the tight houses and bustling marketplaces of medieval Europe. This mutation was unstoppable. Within a day of infection, symptoms appeared: Within 2 days, lungs filled with blood. Within 3, most victims were dead. Imagine walking through a marketplace filled with hundreds of people, everyone shouting, trading, laughing. Now imagine someone coughing in the center of that crowd. That single cough could doom the entire neighborhood. The plague wasn't just killing, it was accelerating. Every victim it infected became a new potential mutation site. Every new mutation created a slightly different version of the disease. Some deadlier than others, cities became biological reactors, where the plague experimented and evolved at terrifying speed. And because the outbreaks were so intense, people panicked. Some locked themselves indoors. Others fled into the countryside, and knowingly carrying the disease with them. Entire towns emptied overnight, their residents running in all directions and spreading the plague to every village, inn, farm, and monastery along the way. The harder people tried to run, the faster the plague moved. Worse still, Europe's interconnected network trade routes, pilgrim roads, ports created a perfect distribution system. A mutated strain in one city could appear 200 miles away within days. Another could travel north, reaching Scandinavia or England, another south into the Middle East or North Africa. The plague flowed through Europe like water, finding every crack. But if cities were amplifiers, humans were accelerators, and commerce was the highway, there was still one more ingredient that made the Black Death so lethal. Not in the environment, not in the bacteria, but inside the people themselves. Because the DNA recovered from medieval skeletons revealed something deeply unsettling. Some people were genetically doomed from the moment the plague reached their doorstep, and that hidden vulnerability is the dark secret of Chapter 5. The genetic weakness hidden in medieval bodies while cities, rats, and climate chaos played their part. Modern DNA analysis revealed something even more unsettling, something medieval people could never have known. The Black Death didn't just exploit environmental conditions, it exploited human biology. And for millions of people in 14th century Europe, their own genes quietly sealed their fate. The story begins in a genetics lab far from medieval graveyards, far from dusty skeletons and uneasy archaeologists. Here, scientists examine the DNA of plague victims and compare it to the DNA of survivors. At first, researchers expect small differences, maybe a random mutation here or there, but what they find instead is a jaw-dropping pattern, a genetic vulnerability, a flaw passed down through generations, a weakness millions of medieval Europeans carried without knowing it. In multiple plague burial grounds across Europe, victims showed a surprising consistency. They lacked certain immune system variations that modern people carry today. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a fingerprint, a signature that the bacteria exploited with ruthless efficiency. One gene in particular stood out, ERAP2. Today, this gene plays a major role in presenting pathogens to our immune system so the body can respond quickly. But in medieval Europe, one version of ERAP2 was incredibly rare, almost non-existent. And this missing genetic defense was like an open door for the plague. Victims with the vulnerable version of the gene showed almost no resistance. Their immune systems reacted too slowly, too weakly. By the time their bodies recognized the bacteria, it was already too late. The infection had overrun them. Imagine being a medieval villager. You might be hardworking, healthy, young, strong, but deep inside your cells, a tiny molecular weakness means that the moment a plague-carrying flea bites you, your chances of survival drop to nearly zero. You'd never know why. Your family would never know why. Your neighbors would blame demons, curses, or foul air. But the truth was written in your DNA. Even more disturbing is what researchers discovered next. The Black Death didn't just exploit this weakness, it changed human evolution itself. After the pandemic, genetic landscape of Europe shifted dramatically. Survivors overwhelmingly carried the stronger, more protective version of ERAP2. It was as if the plague acted like a brutal editor, carving away genetic vulnerabilities through mass death. The Black Death wasn't just a killer, was a genetic filter. But ERAP2 wasn't the only clue. As scientists expanded their study, they found additional immune system genes showing massive shifts after the 14th century. Some affected inflammation levels, others controlled how fast the body responded to infection. Many of these genes were common before the Black Death, and rare afterward. The plague didn't just kill people, it selected who could survive future diseases. But here's where things take an even stranger twist. While some genes made medieval people more vulnerable, others made them more resistant, and that meant survival often appeared random. Entire families died, yet one child lived. Whole villages perished, yet a handful of people walked away untouched. Medieval chroniclers described this with awe and confusion. They thought these survivors were chosen by God. In a way, they were chosen, just not by heaven. They were chosen by biology, and something else was influencing the death toll, to something far less genetic and far more physical. Most medieval Europeans were chronically malnourished. Years of famine earlier in the century weakened immune systems across the continent. People lacked vitamins, proteins, and basic nourishment needed to fight infection. Their bodies were already struggling before the plague arrived. Poor villagers were hit hardest. Their diets were worse. Their living conditions were cramped. Their stress levels were higher. And stress itself weakens immunity, a detail medieval people could never have known. So when the plague swept across Europe, it struck an already fragile population, a population whose genes hadn't evolved defenses yet, a population weakened by hunger, hardship, and disease long before the Black Death arrived. But perhaps the most haunting revelation of all comes from the DNA of the plague bacterium itself. When scientists compared ancient strains to modern ones, they discovered that the medieval versions were genetically structured to overwhelm exactly these weaknesses. Almost as if the bacteria were learning, adapting to exploit the vulnerabilities of the population it encountered. The plague wasn't just evolving, it was evolving with us. This raises a chilling question. If medieval people carried genetic weaknesses that made the Black Death so deadly, what about us today? What hidden vulnerabilities lie in modern human DNA? Could a future pathogen exploit them just as ruthlessly? To uncover the final truth and the final twist brought by medieval DNA, we have to follow the story into the last chapter, where scientists reveal what this ancient killer left behind, and what it means for humanity today. The final twist: how the plague still lives inside us today. For most people, the Black Death is a tragedy sealed in the past, a dark chapter carved into stone monuments, old manuscripts, and eerie medieval artwork. But the final surprise uncovered by modern DNA research is this: the plague didn't vanish when the medieval world did. It lives on. Not just in rodents, not just in bacteria, but inside us. When scientists finished mapping medieval plague strains and comparing them with the DNA of modern humans, they stumbled into a truth far bigger than they expected. The Black Death changed the course of human evolution so dramatically that its fingerprints can still be found in our immune systems today, like a ghost clinging to our bones. The survivors of the 14th century passed their protective genes to their children. Those children passed them to future generations. Over centuries, these traits spread across populations, shaping the immune landscape of modern Europe. The protective version of ERAP2, for example, is now far more common in people today than it ever was in the medieval era. Survival became inheritance. But here's the twist, the kind of twist that makes scientists pause, stare at their findings, and rethink everything they thought they knew. Some of the genetic changes that protected our ancestors hurt us now. Many immune system traits that helped medieval people fight off the plague are linked today to autoimmune disorders, conditions where the immune system becomes too aggressive and attacks the body itself. Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, these are more common in populations descended from plague survivors. It's as if evolution made a trade: short-term survival in the Middle Ages for long-term health consequences centuries later. A terrible bargain no one knew they made. And that's only the beginning. When scientists reconstructed the medieval plague genome, they discovered something else. Today's strains are less deadly. Modern Yersinia pestis is still dangerous, yes, but not the unstoppable monster it once was. Antibiotics help, but even without them, today's strains don't kill at medieval rates. Why? Because the ancient DNA shows that the 14th century version was uniquely aggressive, far more virulent than anything circulating in the world right now. It had mutated to peak lethality. It had evolved in a pressure cooker of collapsing ecosystems, starving rodents, overcrowded cities, and genetically vulnerable humans. It was, in a chilling sense, a perfect storm pathogen. But storms don't last forever. After burning through millions of hosts, the plague gradually lost evolutionary pressure. As Europe's population stabilized, as cities rebuilt, as rodents recovered, the bacterium shifted. Mutations slowed, virulence decreased. The supercharged medieval strains faded out. The Black Death killed so many people that it essentially burned itself out of existence. And yet, it never fully disappeared. Small outbreaks continued for centuries. Flea-borne transmissions still appear today in parts of Africa, Asia, and even the United States. The plague still lives in rodent populations, still evolves quietly in the wild, holding onto remnants of its ancient power. But perhaps the most unnerving discovery of all came when scientists compared ancient plague DNA from Europe with newer strains from around the world. They found fragments, tiny genetic echoes of the Black Death inside multiple modern lineages. The medieval plague didn't die. It spread, split, transformed, and adapted. Pieces of it traveled to Russia, China, the Americas. The monster didn't vanish, it fragmented, like a shattered mirror. Its reflections survive everywhere. But as modern as this revelation sounds, the greatest question isn't about bacteria at all. It's about us. Because medieval DNA didn't just uncover how people died, it revealed how we live. It showed that humanity is still shaped by ancient catastrophes, that the bodies we inherit today are sculpted by the battles our ancestors fought, that the immune traits protecting us from viruses, flus, and modern outbreaks are the direct result of a disease that struck 700 years ago. Without the Black Death, we wouldn't be the humans we are. And in a strange way, knowing this brings a strange kind of comfort, even in the darkest moments of history, moments of terror, loss, and unimaginable suffering. Something survives, adapts, and evolves. Something learns. The final truth revealed by medieval DNA is not that a disease once killed half of Europe. It's that humanity endured, changed, grew stronger. And now, with a deeper understanding of how ancient pathogens shaped our biology, scientists are better prepared to predict future pandemics, identify genetic risks, and understand how evolution responds to crisis. The Black Death's legacy is written into our cells, but so is our resilience. And perhaps that is the quiet message echoing across 7 centuries. Even when the world breaks, life finds a way to rebuild. If you'd like, I can now create the YouTube description, SEO keywords, tags, and a thumbnail prompt to complete your video package.